Hey there, this is Sid and today we shall solve a SQL problem from StrataScratch. The title of the problem is Users Exclusive per Client. It's listed as a medium difficulty problem and the ID of the problem is 2025. As always, we shall first have a look at the input table. There is only one input table called fact events and I have exported that table to Excel so it's easier to understand. So here is the input table. It has 7 columns and it lists the activities of users who can perform different kinds of events like sending a message, receiving a file, receiving a video call, etc. and can do so from two different types of devices, can be desktops or mobiles. So the first column is the ID column which uniquely identifies each row of this table. The second column is the time ID column which states when the event happened. And the third column is the user ID column which is who the user was. So the same user can be logged on to different customer IDs. So for example, this user is first logged on to SendIt, and then the same user is logged on to ConnectX, and so on. The next column is the client ID, which states whether the user used a desktop or a mobile to perform the activity. The next column is the event type, what exactly was done, and then you have an event ID column, which is a unique identifier for the event type. So for example, message sent is ID 3, file received is ID 2, and so on. So now that we understand the input table, let's go back to the problem statement. It says that write a query that returns the number of users who are exclusive to only one client. What does that mean? That means we have to find out how many such users are there who have used only one type of device across all the rows of the table, wherever they appear in this table. So for example, this user on the first instance used a desktop and then down here in the second instance used a mobile. So the question is not interested in users like this. Regardless of how many times the user appears in this table, he or she should be using the same client ID. Can be a desktop or a mobile, but should not be both. And then what it asks next is output the client ID and number of such exclusive users. So the final output should be for desktop, how many distinct users are there who only use desktop but never a mobile, and for mobile, how many distinct users are there who always used a mobile but never a desktop. So now that we understand the problem, let's try to solve the problem in Microsoft Excel. I have created a pivot table here where in column I have the distinct user IDs, and in columns J and K I have the number of instances when that particular user is logged on to a desktop client and to a mobile client. So for example, this user 0280-XJGEX was logged on a total of 5 times, and out of those 5 times, on 3 occasions he or she was logged in via a desktop and on 2 occasions via a mobile. So our question is not interested in users like this. So as you can see, for the 2 rows that I have highlighted, these 2 users have used only a desktop client but never a mobile client. There is no user who has used only a mobile client but never a desktop client, because if you look at column J, you never find an empty row or a blank row. So that means all users, regardless of whether he or she has used a mobile client or not, has definitely used a desktop client. So you are not going to find cases where you have only mobile client usage from a given user. So now that I have highlighted the 2 rows that contains the users who have used only one type of client, namely desktop, it's easy to see what the final output would look like. The final output should say, for the client ID desktop, there are 2 users, namely this and this user, who has never used a mobile. For mobile, there are no such cases because as we discussed, there are no users who have used only mobile but not a desktop. So now that we understand the problem and how to solve it in Microsoft Excel, let's try to translate it to SQL. As always, I have written the SQL code in Notepad++ because it's much easier to understand it there. Let's start reading the query inside out. So let's look at this inner query first. It says that select user ID from, and then I have one more inner query which says select user ID and the count of distinct clients from the facts events grouped by the user ID. So let's see what this innermost inner query does first. So if I copy only this part of the inner query, what it does is it shows us the user ID and the distinct clients that the user ID has ever logged in from. So the maximum value can be 2 because a given user ID can at most log in from 2 different kinds of clients, desktop and mobile. So it lists all the user IDs by the count of distinct clients. For example, this user was logged in only from a desktop. This user also was only logged in from a desktop. There are no other users who was only logged in from one type of client. Now going back to the SQL inner query, I have introduced a having clause to filter the output from the query that we just discussed. So now if I run this entire inner query, I will find that it outputs only those 2 users who only used one type of client. So far, by just looking at this query, we don't know whether that client was a desktop or a mobile, but this much we know, that they used only one but not the other. So I hope we understand the inner query now. Now we use this inner query on this outer query here, where it says select the client ID. Remember, the client ID is either a desktop or a mobile, and then count the distinct user IDs from the fun facts table where the user ID belongs to this group of users. Who are this group of users? Remember, this group of users is just this table. So I'm taking the user IDs from this subquery, which ensures that I have only those users who have at most logged on from one kind of client. So all the outer query does is it goes back to the original table and finds out for each client ID, desktop or mobile, the distinct number of users, making sure that before counting the distinct users, it only uses those users who had ever logged on from only one kind of client, either a desktop or a mobile. In our example, it is only a desktop as we know. So client ID here and the count of distinct users here, where user ID are one of those 2 users. So what will the count of distinct users be? It will obviously be 2 for the client ID desktop because you had only 2 such users here. Had there been a couple of other users who had only logged in from mobile but never from desktop, the client ID would also have had the value mobile and the count of distinct user IDs, ensuring the user IDs belong to this subquery, would have returned the number of distinct users who used only a mobile device. So now that we understand the query, let's run the entire query in StrataScratch and see what the output is. So when we run it, we see that there is a client ID desktop and the count is 2, which agrees with the output provided by StrataScratch. So I hope I was able to explain the solution to this problem. I'll keep coming back with solutions to more problems from StrataScratch, so please stay tuned.